The November wind carried death through the pines outside Caleb Stone's cabin, and the old man lying in bed could taste it on his tongue like copper pennies. 77 years had carved deep lines into his weathered
Not
face,
done
and the
yet.
consumption
This
eating
way.
his lungs had turned his breath into a wet rattle that filled the small room with the sound of borrowed time running out. But his eyes remained sharp glacier blue and unflinching as they fixed on the young man sitting beside him in the flickering candlelight. Thomas Stone Jr. was 19, tall and lean, like his grandfather had been at that age, with the same stubborn set to his jaw that Caleb recognized from looking in mirrors for most of a lifetime. The boy wore the stiff collar of a man trying to appear older than his years, and his hands kept fidgeting with the train ticket in his pocket. Tomorrow morning he would board the 6 a.m. to Chicago, then on to New York, then across an ocean to fight in a war that had already devoured millions of young men just like him. The Great War, they called it, as if giving horror a grand name somehow made it noble. Caleb coughed and blood flecked his handkerchief. Thomas started to rise, but the old man waved him back down with one gnarled hand. "Boy, come closer," Caleb said, his voice like gravel sliding down a mountainside. "My time's short, and there's a story you need to hear before you ship out tomorrow. About 3 women who walked through fire and the winter that taught me what it means to be a man worth dying for." Thomas leaned forward, and in the candlelight, Caleb could see fear flickering behind the boy's brave facade. Good. Fear kept a man alive. It was the absence of fear that killed. "Grandpa, you should rest," Thomas began, but Caleb cut him off with a look that could stop a charging grizzly. "I'll rest soon enough. Been resting for 40 years if I'm honest. But your grandmother Grace made me promise before she passed that if anything happened to her, I'd tell you the truth. All of it. Not the pretty version folks tell at church socials. The real story with all the blood and fear and choices that haunt a man in the dark." The old man shifted in bed, wincing as his ravaged lungs protested. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the shutters like restless spirits demanding entry. Somewhere in the valley below, a wolf called out to the November moon, and Caleb remembered other nights, other wolves, and the taste of desperation that came with winter in the high country. "This starts with death," Caleb said. "My brother Daniel, and my cowardice." Thomas opened his mouth to protest, but Caleb raised a hand. "You think you know fear, boy? Wait until you're standing on a riverbank, watching your brother drown 50 feet away, and your legs won't move. 3 seconds. That's how long I froze. 3 seconds killed Daniel, and those 3 seconds led me to grace. Funny how God works, turning punishment into salvation if you live long enough to see it." The old man's eyes drifted closed, and when they opened again, he wasn't seeing the cabin walls anymore. He was seeing spring runoff white water and a young man's face disappearing beneath the foam. "Let me take you back," Caleb whispered. "April 1875, Snake River, where Idaho kisses Montana. That's where it started. That's where I learned what happens when fear freezes a man's blood." The world shifted, and suddenly it was 42 years earlier, and Caleb Stone was 39 years old with a strong back and steady hands standing on a riverbank, with his whole life about to change forever. The Snake River ran high that April morning, swollen fat with snowmelt from the mountains that towered white and indifferent against the brilliant blue sky. Caleb stood on the north bank knee-deep in water, cold enough to stop a man's heart, testing the current's strength with a stripped pine branch. Behind him on the rocky shore, his younger brother Daniel waited with the pack horse, its panniers loaded heavy with winter furs. 400 pounds of beaver marten and wolf pelts that represented 6 months of hard work in country that could kill a man a dozen different ways before breakfast. Caleb pushed the branch deeper into the flow, feeling how the water wanted to rip it from his grip. The current ran maybe 8 miles per hour here, where the river narrowed between 2 granite shelves, fast but manageable if a man kept his wits and his footing. He'd crossed worse. They both had. "How's it look?" Daniel called from shore, his voice carrying that easy confidence that had always come natural to him, the way charm came natural to some men and violence to others. At 29, Daniel was everything. Caleb wasn't quick to laugh, slow to anger, beloved by every person he met, from trading post owners to Salish chiefs. He had their mother's warm brown eyes and their father's gift for storytelling, and he'd come west to visit his hermit brother with dreams of convincing him to return to civilization, where people lived close enough to hear each other's troubles and joys. They'd been arguing about it for 2 weeks. It's high, Caleb answered, pulling the branch free and wading back to shore. Water streamed from his canvas pants as he climbed onto dry rock. But we've crossed higher. Keep Buck calm and we'll be fine. I'll go first test the footing. You follow my line exactly. Don't let the horse drift downstream. Daniel nodded, already moving to check the ropes that secured their precious cargo to the pack horse's frame. Buck was a good animal, steady and strong, but even good horses could panic in fast water, and a panicked horse was 700 pounds of thrashing death waiting to happen. Caleb watched his brother work, and something cold touched the base of his spine. A premonition maybe, or just the memory of their older brother Samuel, who drowned when Caleb was 10 and Samuel was 7, pulled under by the White River back in Indiana, while Caleb stood on the bank watching, too young and too small to do anything but scream for help that came too late. He pushed the memory away. That was almost 30 years gone. Different river, different time, different man. Ready? Caleb asked. Oh, always. Daniel grinned, and there was sunlight in that grin, the kind that made a man believe tomorrow would be better than today. Caleb entered the water first, moving slowly, feeling each step before committing his weight. The current pushed hard against his legs, trying to sweep them downstream, but he leaned into it, using his body like a wedge to split the flow. The river bottom was all rounded stones, the size of skulls, treacherous and uneven, and twice he nearly lost his balance before finding the rhythm that kept him upright. Halfway across the water, reached his waist. He could feel his body heat bleeding away into the glacial melt, feel his muscles starting to stiffen. Another 30 feet and he'd be across, up onto the south bank, and they could make the trading post by nightfall, convert their furs to cash money, and begin the long trip back to the high country where Caleb had built his solitary life. He glanced back to signal Daniel. His brother had already started across, one hand on Buck's bridle, speaking soft words the river's roar drowned to nothing. The horse followed reluctantly, eyes rolling white, but Daniel's steady presence kept the animal moving forward, trusting the man who fed him and brushed his coat and whispered to him in the dark quiet of mountain meadows. They were doing fine. Everything was going to be fine. Then the current caught Buck broadside. Later, Caleb would replay that moment 1,000 times, would see it in dreams and waking visions, and in the bottom of whiskey bottles when the guilt got too heavy to carry sober. The way the water suddenly surged, some underwater swell or eddy born of rocks and depth, and the physics of fluid moving downhill. The way Buck's feet slipped on the rounded stones. The way the horse tried to rear to get his front hooves up and out of the treacherous footing, but the weight of the furs kept him down. The way Daniel's hand, rope-wrapped for better grip, suddenly became a shackle, binding him to 700 pounds of panicking animal. The horse went sideways. Daniel went under. Caleb saw his brother's head disappear beneath the white foam, saw the rope go taut as Buck thrashed and rolled, and in that instant, Caleb Stone faced the defining choice of his life. 50 feet of fast water separated them. The current was running 8, maybe 10 miles per hour here, where it picked up speed between the granite shelves. Daniel was underwater, tied to a drowning horse, and every second mattered. Every fraction of a second. The mathematics were simple: dive, now swim hard, maybe reach Daniel in time. Hesitate, and the current would sweep his brother into the rapids downstream, where jagged rocks waited like teeth. Caleb's body froze. Not a conscious choice. Not cowardice exactly, though he would call it that for the rest of his life. It was something deeper, something primal. The old terror from childhood reaching up through the years to lock his muscles solid. He saw Samuel's face in the water. Saw himself at 10 years old, helpless and screaming. Saw the White River and the Snake River become one river, and all the rivers that had ever drowned and all the brothers who'd ever died. 3 seconds passed. Then Caleb's mind caught up to his body, and he dove. He swam harder than he'd ever swum in his life, arms pulling, legs kicking, fighting the current that wanted to sweep him past his brother and into oblivion. The cold stabbed into his chest like knives, and his clothes dragged at him, but he kept moving, kept reaching, kept trying to close that terrible distance. 20 seconds later, he reached Daniel. 10 seconds too late. His brother's face was blue beneath the water, eyes open and fixed on something far beyond the river, beyond the mountains, beyond the April sky. The rope had tangled in the rocks on the riverbed, and Buck's thrashing had pulled it tight around Daniel's wrist, holding him under like an anchor made of his own mistake. Caleb got his knife out, got the rope cut, got his brother's body dragged to the south bank, where he laid him out on the rocks and tried every method he knew to bring breath back to drowned lungs. He used the Sylvester method, pressing down on Daniel's chest, then raising his arms overhead to expand the ribs, forcing air in and water out. He did it for 30 minutes while the sun climbed higher, and Buck wandered the far bank trailing rope, and looking confused, and the trading post waited unaware that two brothers had left for it, but only one would arrive. When Caleb finally accepted that Daniel was gone, he didn't scream, didn't curse God, or the river, or the fate that seemed determined to drown every brother he had ever loved. He just sat there in the April sun, with his brother's body getting cold beside him, and understood with a clarity that felt like falling that those 3 seconds of paralysis had killed Daniel just as surely as if Caleb had held his head under himself. Fear had frozen him. Fear born from old trauma, from a 10-year-old boy's helplessness, from the terror of drowning that Caleb had carried inside him since the day Samuel died. And because Caleb had been afraid Daniel was dead, he wrapped the body in a blanket, walked 12 miles to the nearest settlement, carrying his brother over his shoulder like a sack of grain, paid a carpenter to build a coffin, paid a preacher to say words that meant nothing, buried Daniel alone under a cottonwood tree, and stood at the grave until the sun went down and the stars came out cold and indifferent overhead. Then Caleb Stone walked away from the life he'd known and into 3 years of isolation that would have killed a weaker man or a stronger one, but fit him perfectly because he was exactly weak and strong enough to survive without ever quite living. He sold the furs, all of them, even Daniel's share, which should have gone to their sister back in Indiana, but which Caleb couldn't bear to touch. Couldn't bear to send along with the letter, explaining how her brothers had gone into the river and only one had come out. He took the money and bought a remote cabin at 9,000 feet in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, in country so high and hard that winter lasted 8 months, and neighbors were a rumor you heard about in valley towns. The cabin had belonged to a trapper who'd frozen to death the previous winter, and it suited Caleb fine. One room, 16 by 20, built from logs the former owner had probably cut himself. A stone fireplace that drew clean, a wood floor that didn't rot, shutters that kept the wind out and the warmth in. Space enough for one man who wanted nothing to do with the world that had taken his brothers and left him alive to remember it. He burned everything that had belonged to Daniel. Every shirt, every book, every small possession except one, the hunting knife their father had given Daniel on his 16th birthday. Caleb kept that not as a comfort but as a punishment, a daily reminder of what 3 seconds of fear could cost. For 3 years, Caleb Stone barely spoke to another human being. He ran trap lines that stretched 50 miles through country where the snow got deep enough to bury a man standing upright. He hunted elk and deer and the occasional bear when one got too interested in his food cache. He read books by firelight, the Bible searching for forgiveness he never found, Shakespeare because tragedy felt honest, Mark Twain because humor reminded him he had once known how to laugh. He became expert at survival. Learned to predict weather 2 days out by watching cloud formations and how the horse's ears twitched. Learned to track any animal that left prints in snow. Learned to set traps so precisely that he could calculate success rates within 3%. Learned that competence could fill the hours even if it couldn't fill the emptiness. Twice a year, he went to the trading post to sell furs and buy supplies, coffee flour, salt, ammunition, the basics that kept a man alive in the high country. The trading post owner tried to make conversation at first, but Caleb's silence eventually taught him that some men weren't looking for company. The guilt never lessened. If anything, it grew heavier with time, accumulating like snowfall layer upon layer, until Caleb woke some morning surprised his heart still beat under the weight of it. He didn't drink himself to death, though he thought about it. Didn't put a bullet through his skull, though he thought about that too. He just existed day after day, season after season, a man waiting for death or redemption, whichever came first. Neither came. Until November 1878, 3 years and 7 months after Daniel drowned, when Caleb was 42 years old and had given up expecting anything from life except more of the same. That's when he heard the screaming. It was the 15th of November, and Caleb was checking his trap line 8 miles south of the cabin, working his way through pine forest, where the morning light came down in golden shafts through the canopy. The traps had yielded well that week, 2 marten, a beaver, and a young wolf with a pelt so thick and silver it would fetch premium price come spring. He was in a good rhythm, the kind of meditative state that came from doing work your body knew by heart, when the wind shifted and brought him the smell of smoke. Not cook fire smoke, not the clean smell of pine burning in a fireplace. This was the thick, greasy smoke of a big fire, a structure fire, something burning that shouldn't be. Caleb climbed the nearest ridge and looked south into the valley where St. Catherine's convent sat like a small collection of wooden buildings clustered around a white chapel. Smoke rose from it in a column that stained the November sky black. And even at this distance, Caleb could see flames dancing orange and hungry through what had been the chapel roof. He'd been to the convent twice, both times to deliver supplies requested by Father Benedict, an elderly priest who traded Caleb coffee and news from the wider world in exchange for venison and elk during the hard months. Good man, Father Benedict. Kind eyes and gentle hands, and the sort of faith that seemed to actually believe the words it preached instead of just using them as weapons. Caleb started down the ridge, moving fast but controlled, and as he got closer, he began to hear the sounds beneath the fire's roar. Gunshots, men shouting, and underneath it all, a woman screaming. He approached from the east using the forest for cover, and what he saw when he reached the clearing made something cold and furious wake up in his chest after 3 years of dormancy. The convent was fully engulfed, flames reaching 40 feet into the air and sending embers spiraling up like evil stars. In the courtyard between the burning buildings, 4 bodies lay in the positions. They died, Father Benedict face down near the chapel door, a pool of blood spreading from beneath him. Sister Agnes sprawled near the well shot in the back while running.
This way.
Sister Ruth collapsed in the doorway of the dormitory. Sister Mary fallen inside the chapel entrance, one hand reaching toward the altar, as if prayer could have saved him. Deeper in the woods, Caleb heard more gunshots, heard men's voices, raised in cruel laughter, heard a woman crying out in terror. He moved toward the sounds without thinking, his body making decisions. His mind would have questioned if it had been given time to consider. Through the trees ahead, he could see movement, 4 men on horseback pursuing 3 women, whose black habits marked them as sisters from the burning convent. The women were running hard, stumbling over roots and rocks, their long skirts catching on brush. And the men were playing with them, firing shots that kicked up dirt near their feet, making sport of their terror. Caleb stopped behind a granite outcrop 180 yards from the chase. He pulled the Sharps rifle from the scabbard on his back, a .50 caliber weapon he had carried since his army days, and checked the load automatically. 1 round chambered, percussion cap seated, sight picture clear. The wind was running about 5 miles per hour left to right. The range was long but manageable. The riders were moving, which complicated things, but they were moving slow, overconfident, certain of their prey. Caleb picked the lead rider, a big man in a leather coat who was laughing as he fired his pistol into the air above the fleeing women. He calculated the lead distance, adjusted for wind and drop, controlled his breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The Sharps boomed, and the big man fell from his horse like he'd been struck by the hand of God. The other 3 riders scattered confused, the sound of the shot echoing through the valley so they couldn't tell which direction it had come from. Caleb had already reloaded his hands, performing the familiar ritual: tear cartridge, pour powder seat, bullet ram, home fresh cap, cock hammer. 8 seconds from shot to ready. He fired again. The second rider jerked in his saddle, grabbed his shoulder, and tumbled sideways off his horse. Not a kill shot, but it put the man on the ground and out of the fight. The remaining 2 riders, smarter or more experienced, dismounted immediately and took cover behind their horses. They fired blindly in Caleb's general direction, but they were using pistols at a range where pistols were little better than throwing rocks. Caleb stood up from behind the outcrop, deliberately exposing himself so they could see exactly where death was coming from. "Next one goes through your skull," he shouted across the distance. "Leave now." For a long moment, the 2 men crouched behind their horses, deciding whether pride was worth dying for. Caleb could see their faces, could see the mathematics happening behind their eyes. Unknown rifle shooter with proven accuracy against 2 men with short-range weapons. The math didn't favor their survival. They chose life. Mounted up, grabbed the reins of their wounded companion's horse and galloped north without looking back, leaving their dead friend in the pine needles, and the 3 women collapsed in exhaustion 100 yards ahead. Caleb approached the women, slowly, rifle lowered, but not put away, making himself as non-threatening as a 6'2" man with a gun could make himself. The 3 sisters had huddled together near a fallen log, and as he got closer, he could see the details that would stay with him. The eldest one bleeding from a head wound, where a bullet had grazed her scalp. The middle one holding a rock like a weapon, her face set in an expression of desperate determination. The youngest sitting in silence with her hands covered in blood that wasn't her own. The eldest sister saw him first. She grabbed a tree branch and brandished it like a club, her voice rough from smoke and screaming. Stay back. Caleb stopped 20 feet away, keeping his hands visible, keeping his body language open and non-threatening. I'm not with them, he said, his voice rusty from disuse. Name's Caleb Stone, trapper. I live north of here. Those men won't be back today. How do we know that? The eldest demanded. Blood ran down the side of her face from where the bullet had carved a furrow across her scalp, but her eyes were clear and hard. If I was with them, Caleb said reasonably, you'd already be dead. The middle sister, the one with the rock, studied him with sharp, analytical eyes. She was looking at his rifle, at the way he held it, at his stance, and his gear, cataloging details and making assessments. You killed 2 men without hesitation, she said. I killed 1 man, Caleb corrected, wounded another. They were hunting women, didn't seem worth hesitating over. The youngest sister spoke for the first time, her voice so soft Caleb almost didn't hear it over the wind in the pines. They killed Father Benedict, Sister Agnes, Sister Ruth, Sister Mary, all of them. Something in her voice, in the hollow way she said those names, reminded Caleb of how he'd sounded telling the preacher about Daniel. He looked at her blood-covered hands and understood she'd tried to help someone who was beyond help, had held them while they died, and now carried the weight of that final intimacy. He knew exactly how heavy that weight could be. I've got a cabin, Caleb said. 2 hours north. Warm, dry, defensible. You stay out here, you'll freeze before morning. We don't know you, the eldest said. True, Caleb agreed. But you know them, and they'll be back with more men once they gather their courage. The middle sister lowered her rock slightly. You could be worse than them. Could be, Caleb said, but I'm not. Question is whether you trust your judgment enough to believe that. The 3 women looked at each other, some silent communication passing between them that Caleb couldn't read. Finally, the middle sister nodded to the eldest. He killed the riders to save us, not to claim us, she said. His body language is defensive, not aggressive. He's offering help, not demanding compliance. The eldest sister touched her bleeding scalp and winced. We don't have many options. The youngest stood up slowly, and when she looked at Caleb, he saw something in her eyes that made his chest hurt, the same hollow acceptance he'd seen in his own mirror for 3 years. The look of someone who'd watched people they loved die and couldn't quite believe they were still breathing. If you try anything, the eldest said, lowering her makeshift weapon, I'll find a way to kill you. Fair enough, Caleb said. That was how it started. 3 women and 1 man standing in a forest while a convent burned in the valley behind them. None of them knowing that the next 4 months would reshape all their lives so completely that looking back, they'd barely recognize the people they'd been in this moment. But first they had to survive the walk to the cabin. The journey to Caleb's cabin took 3 hours instead of 2 because the youngest sister Grace kept stumbling, her body shutting down from cold and shock and the weight of what she'd witnessed. Caleb watched her deteriorate with the clinical eye of a man who'd seen hypothermia kill, noting the bluish tint spreading across her lips, the way her hands had stopped shaking because they'd gone too numb to shake the glazed quality entering her eyes. That meant her core temperature had dropped past the point where her body could generate its own heat. 8 miles of rough country separated them from safety, and the temperature was dropping 2 degrees every hour as the sun tracked toward the western peaks. They'd started at 18 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time full dark arrived, it would be near 0, and a woman dressed in nothing but a torn habit and thin shoes would be dead long before they reached shelter. Margaret, the eldest, kept pace despite the bullet wound that had carved a 3-inch furrow across her scalp. Blood had dried in her hair, matting it into dark clumps, but she walked with her spine straight and her jaw set, refusing to show weakness, even as Caleb could see her swaying slightly with each step. Kate, the middle sister, scanned the forest constantly, her head on a swivel, checking their back trail and the shadows between the trees like a soldier expecting ambush. She'd picked up a sturdy branch somewhere along the way and carried it like a club, and Caleb respected that survival instinct, that refusal to be caught helpless twice. But Grace was failing, and there was no hiding it. At the 4-mile mark, she went down hard, her legs simply folding beneath her like wet paper. Caleb caught her before she hit the frozen ground, and when he touched her skin, it felt like touching marble, cold and lifeless. "She can't keep going," Margaret said, her voice tight with fear trying to disguise itself as anger. "No," Caleb agreed. He checked Grace's pulse at her throat, found it thready and slow. Her pupils were dilated, unfocused. Early-stage hypothermia sliding toward moderate. They had maybe an hour before it became severe, and severe meant death. "We stop, she dies. We slow down, we all die. Nearest shelter is my cabin 4 miles north." "Then what do you suggest?" Kate demanded. Caleb didn't answer with words. He simply shifted his rifle to his back, bent down, and lifted Grace in his arms. She weighed maybe 110 pounds, soaked through light enough that carrying her wouldn't be impossible. But 4 miles over rough terrain, while maintaining the pace they needed, was going to cost him. He felt the old injury in his left leg immediately, the place where a grizzly had opened him up 6 years ago, tearing through muscle and scraping bone before Caleb had put 3 bullets into its skull. The wound had healed badly because Caleb had stitched it himself with whiskey for anesthetic and stubbornness for medicine. And now it ached in cold weather, and sometimes gave out entirely if he pushed too hard. He could feel it threatening to betray him with each step, but there was no choice. Leave Grace or carry her. Mathematics of survival reduced to their simplest form. "Let's move," he said, and started walking. Margaret fell in behind him, one hand pressed to her bleeding scalp. Kate took up the rear, still scanning for threats, still ready to fight despite having nothing to fight with except determination and a tree branch. They covered the last 4 miles as the sun bled out across the western sky and the temperature plunged toward the kind of cold that could stop a man's heart if he stood still too long. Caleb's legs burned, and his back screamed, and his old bare wounds sent jolts of white fire up his spine with every step. But he kept moving because stopping meant dying, and he'd done enough dying for one lifetime. Full dark had fallen by the time his cabin appeared through the trees, a solid shape of logs and stone that meant warmth and safety and the chance to survive another night. Caleb kicked the door open and carried Grace inside, laying her on the floor near the fireplace that still held gray embers from that morning's fire. "Strip her wet clothes," he ordered, already moving to build up the fire. "Wet fabric will kill her faster than the cold. Get her down to undergarments and wrap her in every blanket you can find." Margaret hesitated for maybe half a second, modesty warring with necessity. Then her practical nature won out, and she began unlacing Grace's habit with quick, efficient movements. Kate found the blankets stacked on a shelf and brought them over, and together the two sisters worked to get Grace out of her soaked clothing while Caleb coaxed the embers back to life. He built the fire the way he'd been building fires since he was 10 years old, the ritual so ingrained he didn't need to think about it. Kindling first the dry pine splinters he kept in a box by the hearth, arranged in a careful pyramid over the embers. Gentle blowing to feed oxygen to the coals, watching for that first lick of flame. Small sticks added once the kindling caught building heat gradually. Split logs added last, positioned to create maximum airflow, and suddenly the fireplace was roaring, pushing back the cold and filling the cabin with light and the smell of burning pine. Caleb heated water in a pot over the growing flames, and when it was warm enough, he poured it into a tin cup and brought it to Grace. She was buried under 3 blankets, now still shaking violently, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear them clicking together. "Drink," he said, kneeling beside her and lifting her head gently. "Small sips. Too fast and you'll vomit." Grace's hands were shaking too badly to hold the cup, so Caleb held it for her, tipping small amounts of warm water past her blue lips. She coughed, sputtered, but got some down, and Caleb could see color starting to return to her face, could see her pupils contracting as her body temperature began its slow climb back towards sustainable life. Margaret and Kate stood near the fire, their own wet clothes steaming in the heat, their faces showing exhaustion and trauma, and the kind of shock that came after adrenaline faded and left nothing behind but the understanding of what had been survived. "Thank you," Margaret said, and those 2 words carried more weight than most sermons Caleb had endured. "You saved her life, all our lives." "Not yet," Caleb said, still watching Grace's color. "She's not out of danger until her core temperature stabilizes. But she's young and strong. She'll make it." He stood up, his bad leg nearly buckling under him, and had to grab the mantel to keep from falling. Kate noticed her sharp eyes missing nothing. "You're hurt," she said. "Old wound," Caleb answered. Axe up in cold weather. I'm fine. You carried her 4 miles on an injured leg, Kate said, and there was something in her voice that might have been respect, or might have been wonder, or might have been both. Caleb shrugged. Needed doing. He moved around the cabin, lighting the oil lantern that hung from a hook on the wall, closing and barring the shutters over the windows, checking that the door was secure. Basic security measures done automatically, while his mind worked through the larger problem: 3 women, 1 cabin winter, closing in, and somewhere out there, men who wanted these women dead, and or worse. We need to talk, Margaret said, about what happens next. Tomorrow, Caleb said. Tonight you sleep, all of you. Grace takes my bed. You two can have the storage room once I clear some space and put down bedrolls. Where will you sleep? Kate asked. Floor by the door. I've slept in worse places. This is your home, Margaret protested. We can't just take over. You're not taking over, Caleb said. You're surviving, different thing. Now come on, let's get that head wound cleaned before it festers. He sat Margaret down at the rough table and examined her scalp by lantern light. The bullet had plowed a furrow about 3 inches long just above her right temple, deep enough to bleed heavily, but shallow enough that it had missed the skull. Lucky if getting shot in the head could ever be called lucky. He cleaned it with whiskey that made Margaret hiss through her teeth, but she didn't pull away, didn't make a sound beyond that initial sharp intake of breath. You've been shot before, Caleb observed, watching how she held herself perfectly still, despite the pain. No, Margaret said, but my father used to stitch up farm animals. I learned early that moving while someone's working on you just makes it worse. Caleb applied pressure to stop the residual bleeding, then fashioned a bandage from clean cloth torn from his spare shirt. His movements were economical, practiced the result of too many years patching himself up after encounters with animals and weather and the general violence of living alone in country that didn't forgive mistakes. That'll hold, he said. Might scar, but you'll keep your hair. Vanity seems like a small concern right now, Margaret said, but she touched the bandage gently, checking his work. While Caleb worked, Kate had been moving around the cabin, taking inventory with that same analytical eye she'd turned on him earlier. She noted the weapons on the wall, the supplies on the shelves, the books stacked beside the bed, the general sense of order and functionality that spoke to a man who lived deliberately. You keep this place neat, she said. Clutter kills in winter, Caleb replied. Everything has its place, makes survival simpler. Grace had stopped shaking so violently and had drifted into an exhausted sleep near the fire. Caleb covered her with another blanket and checked her pulse, again satisfied, when he found it stronger, steadier. She'd make it through the night. He showed Margaret and Kate the storage room, a space about 8 feet by 10 that held his food supplies, trapping gear, and the accumulated detritus of 3 years of solitary living. Together, they cleared enough floor space for 2 bedrolls, and Caleb brought them blankets and a pillow
This way.
each. Door's got a bolt, he said, showing them the iron latch on the inside. Lock it if you want. I won't be offended. And if we need something in the night, Kate asked. Knock. I'll hear you. I don't sleep heavy. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, some calculation happening behind her eyes that Caleb couldn't read. Finally, she extended her hand. Partners then, she said, until we figure out what comes next. Caleb took her hand. Her grip was firm, calloused from work, the handshake of someone who'd done hard labor and wasn't ashamed of it. Partners, he agreed. That night, Caleb laid out his bedroll near the door and stretched out with his rifle within arm's reach, listening to the sounds of 3 women settling into uneasy sleep. Grace breathed deeply by the fire, her body finally warm enough to rest properly. In the storage room, he could hear Margaret and Kate's quiet voices, too low to make out words, but the tone suggesting they were processing the day's trauma, trying to make sense of survival when others had died. Caleb stared at the ceiling beams and thought about Daniel, about the 3 seconds that had killed his brother, about how fear could freeze a man solid just when courage was needed most, about how he'd spent 3 years punishing himself for that moment of paralysis. But today, when he'd heard women screaming and seen men hunting them like animals, he hadn't frozen. He'd moved. He'd acted. He'd killed without hesitation, because the situation demanded killing. And for the first time since the river, Caleb felt something shift in the cold place where his heart used to be. Maybe this was redemption. Maybe this was God's terrible sense of humor, giving Caleb a chance to save 3 lives because he'd failed to save 1. Maybe it meant nothing at all, just random chance in a random universe that didn't care about guilt or grace or the weight that men carried through their days. He didn't know. But as he drifted towards sleep, listening to Grace breathe and the fire crackle and the November wind test his shutters, Caleb thought that maybe, just maybe, he was tired of carrying the weight alone. Morning came gray and cold, and Caleb woke to find frost on the inside of the windows and his breath misting in the air. The fire had burned down to coals overnight, and he built it back up before any of the women stirred, moving quietly through the familiar morning ritual. Coffee first, the good stuff. He saved for special occasions, grounds measured into the pot and water from the bucket by the door heated to boiling. The smell filled the cabin, rich and dark, better than any church incense. Margaret emerged from the storage room, first her bandage slightly askew, but the bleeding stopped. She'd slept in her underthings and had wrapped a blanket around herself like a shawl, and there was something about seeing her like this, vulnerable but unashamed, that made Caleb turn away and busy himself with the coffee pot. "Morning," she said. "Morning," Caleb replied. "Coffee's almost ready. How's your head?" "Hurts like hell, but I'm alive to feel it." Kate came out next, already dressed in her habit despite it still being damp in places. She'd braided her hair and washed her face and looked like someone determined to maintain dignity even in impossible circumstances. Grace woke last, sitting up slowly and looking around the cabin with confused eyes until memory caught up to her and understanding flooded in. She touched her face, felt the warmth in her skin, and looked at Caleb with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You carried me," she said. "You needed carrying." 4 miles. Closer to 5 the way we came. Terrain was rough. Grace looked like she wanted to say something else, but Margaret interrupted by sitting down at the table with a heavy sigh. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said. "About why those men burned the convent. About why they'll come looking for us." Caleb poured coffee into 4 tin cups and distributed them, then took a seat himself. "I'm listening." What came out over the next hour was a story of evil hiding behind respectability, of a trusted priest corrupted by greed, of young women who'd sought shelter and found slavery instead. Margaret told most of it, her voice steady and matter-of-fact, but Kate filled in details and Grace added confirmation with small nods or whispered affirmations. 2 weeks ago, Father Benedict had discovered ledgers hidden in Reverend Marcus Thorne's private office. Accounting books that detailed a trafficking operation that had been running for at least 2 years out of St. Catherine's Convent. 14 women, most of them fleeing bad situations or seeking fresh starts, had been promised safe passage to other convents or new lives out west. Instead, they'd been sold. Prices listed next to names like they were cattle. Destinations that weren't convents at all, but mining camps and cattle towns and places where women disappeared and nobody asked questions. Father Benedict had been writing to the Archbishop, preparing to expose Thorne's operation, when Thorne discovered what he was doing. That morning, while Margaret and Kate and Grace had been out gathering herbs in the forest, Thorne had confronted Benedict in the chapel. They'd heard arguing, then a gunshot, then screaming. By the time they'd gotten back to the convent, Father Benedict was dead at the altar. The 3 elderly nuns who'd helped run the place were being murdered by men with guns, and the buildings were already burning. Thorne had seen them, ordered his men to clean up the loose ends, and the chase had begun. "So you're witnesses," Caleb said when the story was finished. "You can testify that Thorne killed Benedict and ran the operation." "Which means Thorne will hunt us until we're dead," Kate said flatly. "Or until he's dead," Caleb corrected. "Or in prison, or runs so far he can't reach you." "None of those seem likely," Margaret said. "Thorne has money connections, respectability. We're 3 nuns nobody will miss. Who's going to believe us over a man of God?" Caleb thought about that while he drank his coffee. She was right, of course. The world didn't care much for women's testimony, especially when it contradicted a respected man's word. Justice was a fine idea in theory, but it usually required power, and these 3 women had none. "Missoula's got a federal marshal," Caleb said, 90 miles northeast. If you could get there, make a formal complaint, they'd have to investigate." "In winter," Kate asked. "Those passes close by December. We'd never make it." "No," Caleb admitted. "You wouldn't, which means you're stuck here until spring thaw. April, maybe May, depending on snow." "That's 6 months," Grace said softly. 6 months of 3 women depending on a stranger who owes them nothing," Margaret added, watching Caleb closely. Caleb met her gaze. You're not strangers anymore. And I don't know much about owing, but I know about doing what's right. You can stay here through winter. Come spring, I'll guide you to Missoula. You testify against Thorne. Let the law handle it. And in the meantime, Kate asked, in the meantime, we survive together. Pool resources, share work, keep each other alive. I hunt and trap. You keep the cabin running. Fair trade. Margaret extended her hand again, and this time when Caleb shook it, the gesture felt less like a temporary arrangement and more like a pact. Partners, she said. Partners, Caleb agreed. The rest of that day and the days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised all of them with how natural it felt. Caleb showed them the cabin's systems and rhythms, how he kept water from freezing, where he cached food supplies, how to read the weather by watching the way clouds moved over the peaks. In return, they brought skills he hadn't known he needed: Margaret's ability to organize and plan, Kate's quick mind for logistics, Grace's gentle competence with anything that needed care. He took Margaret out to the target range he'd set up behind the cabin, a fallen log at 50 yards with notches carved to mark center mass, handed her the Spencer carbine, and watched her struggle with the first few shots, jerking the trigger and sending rounds wide. You're fighting the weapon, he said. Don't force it. Gentle squeeze like you're trying not to wake a baby. Margaret tried again, and this time the round hit the log 2 feet left of center. Better. Now breathe out, pause, squeeze during the pause. The next shot hit 6 inches from center mass. The shot after that hit dead center, and Margaret lowered the rifle with a small smile. I'll do, Caleb said, which was about as close to praise as he got. With Kate, he taught tracking, took her into the woods and showed her how to read the forest floor, how every animal left its signature in disturbed snow or bent grass or scat that told you species and age and how recently it had passed. She absorbed information like blotting paper soaked up ink, asked sharp questions, made connections he hadn't expected. You've got a tactical mind, he told her. Ever been in combat? No, Kate said. But I learned early that knowing what's coming means surviving what comes. Grace was different. She didn't want to learn weapons or tracking, but when Caleb showed her his herb collection, she identified plants he hadn't known the names for and explained their medicinal properties with the confidence of someone who'd been trained by an expert. And when he mentioned the old bear wound in his leg, how it had healed wrong and gave him trouble, she asked to examine it. He'd been reluctant, but something about her quiet competence made him trust her. He rolled up his pant leg and showed her the scar, thick and ropey and purple-red even after 6 years. Grace probed it gently with strong fingers that knew exactly what they were looking for. Infection trapped under scar tissue, she said. Creates pressure on the muscle. I can reopen it, drain it, stitch it properly. But it's going to hurt. Do it, Caleb said. She sterilized her instruments in boiling water, had him bite down on a leather strap, and went to work with the precision of a trained surgeon. The pain was extraordinary, a white-hot lance that made Caleb's vision go gray at the edges, but he didn't make a sound. Grace cut through scar tissue, drained infection that had been building for years, cleaned the wound with whiskey that burned like liquid fire, and stitched it closed with sutures so small and precise they barely left marks. When she finished, Caleb flexed his leg and felt full range of motion for the first time since the grizzly had opened him up. The constant ache that had been his companion for 6 years was gone, just gone like a weight lifted off that he'd forgotten he was carrying. Where did you learn that? He asked. Dr. Chatin, Morrison at the convent, Grace said, cleaning her instruments. He said I had a gift, hands that don't shake. He was right, Caleb said, and meant it. By the end of the first week, they'd established routines that felt like they'd been in place for years. Caleb woke before dawn, built the fire-started coffee. Margaret took over cooking breakfast, while Caleb checked his trap lines. Kate maintained the cabin, keeping everything in order, anticipating problems before they developed. Grace managed their medical supplies and mended clothing and did the 1,000 small tasks that kept a household running. Evenings they ate together at the table that had been set for 3 years. Caleb read aloud, sometimes his voice rough but steady, working through Shakespeare or Twain or the Bible, and the women listened while working on their own projects. Margaret cleaned weapons with the methodical care of someone who'd learned that maintenance mattered. Kate studied Caleb's maps and books, absorbing knowledge. Grace worked with herbs or bandages or whatever needed her gentle attention. Sometimes Grace watched Caleb when she thought he wasn't looking, and sometimes Caleb watched Grace when he thought she wasn't looking, and Margaret noticed both and said nothing. The first snow came on November 30th, big wet flakes that started at noon and didn't stop for 16 hours. When it was done, the world was buried under 2 feet of heavy white, and winter had officially arrived. Caleb stood on the porch the next morning, surveying the changed landscape, and thought about how different this winter felt from the previous 3. His cabin no longer echoed with loneliness. His table no longer held place settings for one. His days no longer stretched empty and silent into nights filled with guilt and whiskey. 3 women who'd been strangers 2 weeks ago now felt like something more. Not family exactly. Not yet. But the possibility of family, the shape of it forming in the spaces between them. Margaret joined him on the porch, her breath misting in the cold air. "Storm's coming," she said, looking at the sky. "Bigger than this one." "How do you know?" "My father taught me. Cloud patterns, the way the wind changes. We've got maybe 3 days before it hits." Caleb looked where she was pointing and saw she was right. Mammatus clouds on the horizon, the kind that preceded severe weather. "We need to prepare," he said. "I know." They spent the next 3 days in controlled frenzies cutting firewood and stacking it under cover, bringing in extra supplies, reinforcing the shutters, checking and double-checking that everything was secured. The storm hit on December 3rd, and it hit hard. Wind that screamed like something dying, snow that came horizontal, temperature that dropped to 15 below zero and kept falling. The cabin shook under the assault shutters, rattling roof creaking, and Caleb knew immediately that the storage room where the women had been sleeping was going to be uninhabitable. By midnight, the temperature in the storage room had dropped to 25 degrees. Grace checked it and reported back with chattering teeth. "We can't sleep there," she said. "We'll freeze." Caleb had known this was coming, had dreaded it because it meant breaking the careful distance they'd all maintained. "Main room," he said. "All 4 of us, nearer the fire." Margaret started to protest modesty or propriety or habit rising up, but Caleb cut her off. "It's survival," he said. "Your vows didn't include freezing to death for the sake of appearances." So they arranged sleeping spaces around the fireplace. Caleb in the far corner, with his back to the wall and his rifle beside him. Margaret nearest the door in the protective position. She seemed to naturally claim Kate in the middle, and Grace closest to the fire because she'd nearly died from cold once, and nobody wanted to risk it again. The first night, nobody slept. They lay there acutely aware of shared space, of proximity, of the breaking down of boundaries that had kept everything proper and distant. Caleb stared at the ceiling. Margaret watched Caleb. Kate watched Margaret. Grace watched the fire. At 2 in the morning, the fire started dying and the temperature began dropping fast. Caleb got up to add wood, moving slowly and announcing himself so he wouldn't startle anyone. "Just me," he said, adding logs. He built the fire back up, returned to his corner, and tried to sleep. Still couldn't. The storm screamed outside, and inside 4 people tried to figure out how to exist together in a space that suddenly felt too small and too intimate and somehow exactly right. The second day of the storm, trapped inside with nowhere to go and nothing to do except wait for the weather to break, conversation finally started. Grace asked first, desperate for anything to break the tension. "Mr. Stone, why did you become a trapper?" Caleb almost deflected, almost gave a short answer that shut down the question, but something made him answer honestly instead. "Grew up farming in Indiana," he said. "Hated it. Watching corn grow that isn't living, it's waiting to die. Left at 17. Tried cowboying, hated taking orders. Tried prospecting, hated being underground. Found trapping. Just me and mountains and animals that don't lie." "Don't you get lonely?" Margaret asked. "Was lonely on the farm surrounded by people," Caleb said. "Less lonely up here alone. Loneliness isn't about bodies nearby. It's about understanding. Mountains understand silence." "What about your brother?" Kate asked carefully. "Did he understand you?" Caleb was quiet for a long time. The storm howled, the fire crackled. Finally he spoke. "Daniel was my opposite. Loved people, loved noise,
Not
loved
done
towns
yet.
and dancing,
This way.
and all the things I couldn't stand. He came west to visit me, thought he'd convince me to move back to civilization. We spent 2 weeks arguing. Last day he said I was hiding from life because I was afraid I'd fail at it. I got angry, said cruel things. Next morning the river took him. Last words I spoke to my brother were words I can't take back. The silence that followed was heavy with shared grief. Then Margaret spoke, her voice soft and raw. My parents burned to death in the Chicago fire, 1871. I was 25. I could have gone back for them, I didn't. Ran instead. Became a nun because I thought God could wash away a coward's guilt. It hasn't worked yet. Kate's turn. My sister Emily was murdered 4 years ago, raped and killed by a man who walked free because the judge was his cousin. I became a nun, thinking I could forgive him, thinking God would quiet the rage. He didn't. Some guilt doesn't wash away, no matter how much you pray. Grace's voice was barely audible. I grew up in that convent. Never knew my parents. Father Benedict and the sisters were my family. All dead now because of ledgers and greed and evil wearing a priest's collar. I should have died with them. Caleb looked at these 3 women, really looked at them, and saw his own reflection, people carrying weights nobody else could see, surviving, but not quite living, bound together by trauma, and the desperate hope that maybe together the burden would be lighter. We're 4 people who couldn't save the ones we loved, he said. Maybe that's why we're here together. Not to fix it, can't fix the dead, but maybe to carry it together. Burden splits 4 ways is lighter than one man carrying it alone. Do you believe that? Margaret asked. I want to believe it, Caleb said honestly. The storm raged for 3 days, and by the time it broke, something fundamental had shifted between them. They'd stopped being strangers sharing a cabin. They'd become something else, something without a name yet, but real nonetheless. On the morning of December 6th, Caleb woke to silence. The storm had passed. Sunlight was trying to break through the cloud cover. He rose and checked the yard, found 4 feet of new snow covering everything, transforming the landscape into something alien and beautiful. Behind him, the cabin was waking up. He heard Margaret moving around, starting the morning routine. Heard Kate checking supplies. Heard Grace humming softly some hymn from her convent days. The sound of Grace's humming did something to Caleb's chest, something he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. He stood on the porch in the December cold and realized with a start that he was happy. Not content, not resigned, actually happy for the first time since Daniel died. Then he saw the horse. A single rider approaching from the south, moving slowly through the deep snow. Too far yet to make out details, but close enough to be a problem. Nobody came up here in winter. Nobody except someone with a reason. Caleb went back inside and got his rifle. Company, he said. The women were at the windows immediately watching the approaching rider. As the figure got closer, they could see it was a young man, maybe 20, looking half frozen and terrified. The rider stopped 50 yards out, hands visible and empty. Message from Reverend Thorne, he called. I'm just delivering. Don't shoot. Throw it and leave, Caleb shouted back. The messenger tossed a folded paper into the snow, wheeled his horse, and was gone, galloping back the way he'd come, like hell itself was chasing him. Caleb retrieved the message, brought it inside, and handed it to Margaret. She unfolded it with shaking hands and read aloud, Mr. Stone, you harbor criminals. 3 sisters who burned St. Catherine's Convent and murdered Father Benedict. The law seeks them. Surrender them by December 15th, or I shall be forced to bring lawful authorities to retrieve them. Blood can be avoided if you cooperate. Regards, Reverend Marcus Thorne. Kate's face had gone pale. He's flipping the story, making us the criminals. Who's going to believe 3 nuns over a respected reverend? Grace whispered. Caleb took the letter back, read it again, seeing the threat beneath the polite words. December 15th was 9 days away. 9 days to prepare for whatever Thorne was planning, because men like that didn't send polite letters unless they were gathering forces. He's giving us time because he needs time, Caleb said. Gathering men, building his story, making sure when he comes it'll be with enough force that we can't resist. How many men? Margaret asked. Dozen, maybe more. Depends how many he can convince we're criminals worth catching. We can't fight a dozen men, Kate said. No, Caleb agreed. But we can make it expensive enough they wish they hadn't tried. He looked at the 3 women, at their frightened faces and determined eyes, and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. I've spent 3 years running from guilt, he said. I'm done running. These next 9 days we prepare. We fortify. We train. And when Thorne comes with his men and his lies and his lawful authorities, we show him what happens when you corner people who have nothing left to lose. Margaret's hand found the Spencer carbine, and Caleb saw her expression harden into something that looked like his own reflection. "Teach us," she said. "Everything you know," Kate added. Grace didn't speak, but she nodded once firm and final. Caleb looked at the calendar on his wall at the 9 days separating them from violence and began planning how to turn his cabin into a fortress that would make Thorne regret every step he took toward it. The long winter had just gotten longer. But this time Caleb wasn't alone in the dark. This time he had something worth fighting for. 9 days passed in a blur of controlled urgency, each hour measured not in minutes, but in tasks completed. Defenses, built, skills learned. Caleb pushed them hard because he knew what was coming, had seen it before in the army, when good men had to defend bad positions against superior numbers. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. 4 people against a dozen or more, limited ammunition. Limited food, winter pressing down like a millstone. Their only advantages were preparation, position, and the willingness to do whatever survival demanded. He taught Margaret to shoot from cover, how to lean around corners without exposing herself, how to reload the Spencer carbine in 15 seconds, even with hands shaking from adrenaline. She proved a natural, her farm girl strength translating into steady aim, her practical mind understanding that hesitation meant death. By day 3, she could hit a man-sized target at 75 yards 7 times out of 10, and Caleb figured that it was good enough to make attackers think twice. Kate struggled with rifles, her hands developing a tremor whenever she aimed at human-shaped targets that Caleb had fashioned from straw and old clothes. He watched her fight some internal battle every time she shouldered the weapon, saw her jaw clench and her breathing go shallow, and finally he handed her the shotgun instead. "Don't aim," he told her. "Point it like you're pointing your finger. Let the spread do the work. 30 yards or less, you'll hit what you're pointing at." Kate fired at a hay bale and obliterated it, and something in her expression shifted from fear to grim satisfaction. "Again," she said. They practiced until her shoulder was bruised purple from the recoil, and she could reload and fire in under 4 seconds. Caleb watched her destroy target after target and thought that Kate carried rage like other people carried water barely contained, waiting for a vessel strong enough to hold it. Grace refused to train with weapons, at first her gentle nature recoiling from the idea of taking human life. But Caleb showed her how to load and unload the Colt revolver, how to clear jams, how to make the weapon safe. "You don't have to use it," he said, "but knowing you can might save your life, or one of ours." Grace learned the mechanics with her characteristic precision, but wouldn't shoot at targets, and Caleb didn't push. Every person had their line, and forcing someone across it before they were ready just broke them. While the women trained, Caleb fortified. He built spike strips from sharpened pine stakes and placed them 100 yards out from the cabin, angled toward any approach and hidden under a light covering of snow. He strung trip wires with bells at 50 yards, creating an early warning system that would give them precious seconds. He felled trees to create barriers that would funnel attackers into kill zones where concentrated fire could do maximum damage. Inside the cabin, he reinforced the shutters with interior cross braces and cut firing ports at strategic angles. He reorganized the furniture into barricades that would provide cover during a firefight. He inventoried ammunition with the care of a miser, counting gold 80 rounds for the Sharps rifle, 120 for the Spencer carbine, 60 for the Colt, 80 for the 2 additional pistols he'd acquired in trades over the years, 40 shells for the double-barrel shotgun. Not enough for a prolonged siege, but enough to make any assault costly. Grace set up a medical station in the corner farthest from the door. Organizing bandages, boiled needles, thread whiskey for antiseptic, and the small vial of morphine Caleb had been saving for emergencies worse than broken bones. She worked with quiet efficiency, and Caleb was grateful she'd found a way to contribute that matched her conscience. On the 8th day, Father Thomas arrived. The old priest rode up the trail on a sway-backed mare that looked as tired as he did, and when Caleb opened the door with rifle ready, Thomas raised both hands in peace. "Friend Caleb," he called. "Just a friend with news." They brought him inside, gave him coffee and a seat by the fire, and waited while he warmed his hands and gathered his words. Thomas was 68, with a weathered face that had seen the worst of humanity during his time as an army chaplain in the Civil War, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone delivering bad news he wished he didn't have to share. Reverend Thorne arrived in Missoula 3 days ago, Thomas said. Told the sheriff you kidnapped 3 nuns and killed 2 of his men. Whole town believes him. He's gathering a posse. 20 men, maybe more. When, Caleb asked. They were outfitting when I left. 2 days behind me at most, maybe less if they push hard. Margaret's face had gone pale. So we're facing 35 men total. Unless I can stop them, Thomas said. I'm riding back to Missoula tomorrow. I'll testify to what I know about Thorne's operation about the trafficking. Maybe I can sway the sheriff, make him see reason. Thorne will kill you, Kate said flatly. Thomas smiled, and there was something sad and brave in that expression. Perhaps. But I didn't survive Gettysburg by hiding when evil rises. Sometimes bearing witness is all a man can do. Before he left at dawn the next morning, Thomas blessed them, his hands on each of their heads in turn. Lord, protect these good souls, he prayed. They fight not from hate, but from love. Steel their hearts, guide their hands, and if they must kill to survive, forgive them, for they know what they do and do it justly. Amen. He rode south into the gray morning, and Caleb watched him disappear into the trees with the certain knowledge that the old priest was riding toward his death with eyes wide open and faith as his only armor. December 15th dawned clear and cold, the kind of day where sound carried for miles, and every breath showed white against the blue sky. Caleb was awake before first light, checking his defenses one final time, making sure everything that could be secured was secured. The women woke to find him at the window, rifle across his lap, watching the southern approach. They're coming, he said without turning. Can't see them yet, but they're coming. Margaret and Kate took their positions at the north and south windows. Grace settled at the medical station, her hands steady as she arranged instruments one more time. They waited in silence, broken only by the ticking of Caleb's pocket watch and the occasional pop from the fire. And when the riders finally appeared through the trees, there were 15 of them, more than Caleb had hoped, but fewer than he'd feared. The man leading them wore black, and even at a distance, Caleb could see the clerical collar that marked him as Reverend Marcus Thorne. Beside him rode a man with a badge glinting on his vest, and that complicated things considerably, because badges carried weight even when the men wearing them were corrupt. They stopped 100 yards out just beyond effective rifle range, and Thorne's voice carried across the snow-covered clearing. Mr. Stone, we mean you no harm. Those women are wanted for murder and arson. The law demands their return. Surrender them peacefully, and you'll face no charges for harboring fugitives. Caleb opened the door and stepped onto the porch, rifle held loosely but ready. These women witnessed you murder Father Benedict, he called back. Your ledgers prove you ran a trafficking ring. You're the criminal here. Thorne's laughter was cultured, dismissive. Who will believe 3 hysterical women over a man of God? I have witnesses who will testify they set the fire. I have Deputy U.S. Marshal Wade Turner riding with me. The law is on my side. The man with the badge urged his horse forward, Winchester rifle resting across his saddle. Mr. Stone, I'm authorized to arrest those women, interfere, and you're obstructing federal law. Stand aside. Caleb looked at that badge and felt the trap closing. The law was a weapon, and Thorne had turned it against them with the skill of someone who'd done this before. Resisting a federal marshal made them outlaws, and outlaws could be shot without trial. Margaret appeared beside Caleb, the Spencer carbine in her hands. He's lying, she said loud enough for the men to hear. Thorne's pained him. Doesn't matter if he's corrupt, Caleb said quietly. That badge makes him law. We resist. We're the criminals in every story they tell after. So we surrender and hang, Kate asked from behind them. Caleb thought about Daniel, about 3 seconds of fear, about a lifetime of running from the moment when courage mattered most. He thought about these 3 women who'd walked into his life carrying their own guilt and grief, who trusted him with their safety, who deserved better than betrayal. Grace, he said, turning to look at her. When I was 10, my brother Samuel drowned, and I couldn't save him. When I was 39, my brother Daniel drowned, and I hesitated 3 seconds before trying. Today I'm 42, and I'm done watching people I love die because I was afraid. He turned back to Thorne, raised his voice so every man in that posse could hear. You want them? Come take them. But you'll have to kill me first. And I promise you, I'll take half of you with me before I go down. Thorne's face twisted with rage. So be it. You had your chance. He signaled his men and they began spreading out, circling the cabin, looking for weak points. Caleb counted them off, 5 to the south, 6 to the east, 4 to the north. Good tactics, dividing their force to attack from multiple angles, but it also divided their strength. Positions, Caleb said, and they moved to their assigned stations like they'd practiced 100 times. The first wave came from the south, 5 men advancing on foot through the snow using trees for cover. They were cautious, professional men who'd done this before. Caleb let them get to 75 yards before he spoke. "Margaret, lead man, you're shot." She sighted, carefully controlled her breathing, and fired. The Spencer's crack echoed across the clearing, and the lead man went down hard, clutching his leg. Not a kill shot, but enough to take him out of the fight. The others scattered, returning fire, and bullets hammered the shutters. Caleb tossed one of the dynamite sticks he'd prepared, fuse already lit, and it landed 10 feet from where 2 men had taken cover behind a fallen log. The explosion was enormous, snow and dirt and wood flying everywhere. And when the smoke cleared, 1 man was down and not moving, and another was crawling away, leaving a blood trail. The remaining men from the south retreated, dragging their wounded. From the east, 6 more came, using the forest for concealment. Kate fired the shotgun through her firing port, the boom like
Not
thunder,
done yet.
but the range was
This
too
way.
far for the spread pattern to do real damage. Still, the sound of it made the attackers hesitate, made them think twice about rushing a cabin that could hit them from multiple angles. 4 men tried the north approach, climbing uphill through deep snow, and Margaret shifted position to engage them. She fired methodically, picking her targets, making every shot count. 1 man fell, then another, and the remaining 2 broke and ran back down the slope. By midday, Thorne's force had lost 5 men to death or serious wounds, and the rest had pulled back to positions 150 yards out beyond effective range to regroup and reassess. Inside the cabin, they took inventory. Margaret had a splinter in her hand from a near miss that had punched through the shutter. Kate's shoulder was bruised purple from shotgun recoil. Grace had treated Margaret's minor wound, and Caleb had taken a bullet graze across his ribs, shallow enough that stitches held it closed. Ammunition expended: 30 rounds, rifle, 20 carbine, 8 shotgun shells. Still enough for another engagement, maybe 2, but not enough for a prolonged siege. "They're setting up camp," Kate said, watching through her firing port. "Planning to wait us out." "How long can we hold?" Margaret asked. Caleb calculated food for 5 days at current rations, ammunition for maybe 2 more serious fights, water good as long as they could reach the creek. But Thorne didn't need to assault them again. He just needed to wait for starvation or desperation to do his work. "We need to change the equation," Caleb said. That night, while Thorne's men huddled around their campfires thinking they had time on their side, Caleb considered and rejected a dozen plans for breaking the siege. A direct assault would be suicide. Trying to slip away through the woods would leave them exposed and hunted. They needed something to shift the balance, some piece they didn't have. 3 days later, on December 18th, they got it. Caleb was on watch, staring out at Thorne's campfires, when he heard horses approaching from the north. Many horses. He grabbed his rifle and woke the others, prepared for the Missoula posse Thomas had warned about, prepared for the fight to turn from difficult to impossible. Instead, Father Thomas rode into the clearing at the head of 20 men, miners, ranchers, townspeople, their faces hard with the kind of anger that came from learning they'd been lied to. Beside Thomas rode a thin man in a doctor's coat, clutching a leather satchel like it contained salvation. Behind them came Sarah Whitmore, Caleb's neighbor from 15 miles away, a widow who ran her own ranch and took nonsense from nobody. Thomas rode straight to where Thorne's men were camped, and his voice carried clear and cold through the winter air. "Stand down, Marshal Turner. This siege is over." Turner rose from his fire hand on his pistol. "This doesn't concern you, priest." "Their daughter Hatcher has evidence," Thomas shouted, and the thin man held up the leather satchel. "Reverend Thorne's ledgers, proof of his trafficking operation." Hatcher's voice shook but held firm. "I stole these from Thorne's office, names, dates, sales recorded in his own hand, including the sale of Emily Brennan to Clayton Voss 4 years ago." The name hit Caleb like a physical blow, and he heard Kate gasp behind him. Emily Brennan, Kate's murdered sister. From the back of Thorne's group, a well-dressed man rode forward, and even in the firelight, Caleb could see the rage and fear warring on his face. This would be Clayton Voss then. Not just Thorne's partner. Something worse. Sarah Whitmore's voice cut through the confusion. "Clayton Voss murdered my husband 2 years ago. Claimed it was an accident, but I saw him do it. Watched him shoot Martin in the back and then lie to the sheriff about it. Thorne's men began backing away, understanding filtering through their ranks that they'd been lied to, that they'd been fighting on the wrong side. Turner pulled his badge off and dropped it in the snow. "I'm done," he said. Voss sat his horse isolated now, and when he spoke, his voice carried the arrogance of a man who'd gotten away with evil for so long he'd forgotten it could catch him. "You want proof, I'll give you proof. 4 years ago, Illinois. Pretty little Emily Brennan. She resisted my business proposal. I persuaded her, vigorously." Inside the cabin, Kate made a sound like a wounded animal. Caleb put a hand on her shoulder, but she shook it off, grabbed the shotgun, and was out the door before anyone could stop her. She stood in the snow, shotgun leveled at Voss 70 yards between them. "You," she breathed. "You killed my sister." Voss smiled, and it was the smile of a man who enjoyed cruelty. "Emily cried for you before she died, called your name. Kate will find you," she said. "But you didn't, did you?" Kate fired, but the range was too far, the spread too wide. Snow kicked up near Voss's horse, but the man himself sat untouched. Caleb was beside her in seconds, his hand on the shotgun barrel, gently pushing it down. "Not like this," he said quietly. "Not murder. Justice." But Voss had pulled a pistol, and suddenly the standoff that had seemed to be resolving erupted into chaos. Thomas's men drew their weapons. Thorne's remaining loyalists did the same. And in the center, Voss sat his horse with a gun in his hand and the look of a man with nothing left to lose. "You want me," he shouted. "Come get me." Caleb stepped forward, unarmed, his rifle left behind in the cabin. "This ends now," he said. "You and me, no guns." Voss's laugh was ugly. "You're unarmed." "I'm not." "Why would I accept that?" "Because if you shoot an unarmed man in front of 20 witnesses, your own men will turn on you, but you fight me hand to hand and you might walk away from this. It's the only chance you've got." Voss considered, then holstered his pistol and dismounted. He was younger than Caleb by maybe 6 years, broader in the shoulders, with the build of a man who'd done hard physical labor. But Caleb had spent 3 years in mountains that killed the weak, had survived grizzly attacks and winter storms and the kind of loneliness that broke lesser men. They circled each other in the snow, while both sides watched, weapons lowered, but ready. Voss threw the first punch, a haymaker that would have taken Caleb's head off if it had connected, but Caleb slipped inside it and drove his fist into Voss's ribs, feeling something crack. They traded blows with the ugly efficiency of men who'd learned to fight in places where losing meant dying. Voss was faster, getting through Caleb's guard to land a punch that split his eyebrow open and sent blood sheeting down his face. Caleb was stronger, his returned blow breaking Voss's nose and sending the younger man staggering back. They grappled, rolled through the snow, and Voss pulled a knife from his boot, slashing Caleb's face from temple to jaw. Caleb headbutted him, felt Voss's already broken nose flatten further, and wrenched the knife away. They were both on their knees now, both bleeding, both exhausted. Voss lunged, and Caleb met him with the knife, driving it up under his ribs and into his heart. Voss's eyes went wide. He coughed blood and fell forward, and Caleb caught him, lowered him to the snow, and watched him die. Kate approached slowly, the shotgun hanging loose in her hands. She looked down at the man who'd murdered her sister, and Caleb saw something in her expression shift from rage to something sadder and more final. "For Emily," she whispered. Thomas's men took Thorne into custody. The Reverend screamed about his rights and his connections and how they'd all pay for this, but nobody was listening. Turner was arrested as well, his corruption exposed by his own willingness to work for Thorne. "They'd both hang," Thomas said, "legal and proper after a fair trial, but first they had to get through winter." The trial happened the first week of January 1879 in a makeshift courtroom in Missoula that was packed with townspeople who'd come to watch respectability unmasked. There was no formal judge yet. The circuit judge wouldn't arrive until spring, but the town had convened a people's court with 12 good men to hear evidence and render verdict. Dr. Hatcher testified first, laying out the ledgers in excruciating detail. 14 women sold over 2 years, prices ranging from $50 to $200 depending on age and appearance. Names and dates and destinations that weren't convents, but mining camps and cattle towns where women vanished and nobody asked questions. Sarah Whitmore testified to watching Voss shoot her husband in the back during a land dispute, then bribe witnesses to claim it had been self-defense. Margaret, Kate, and Grace testified to what they'd witnessed: Father Benedict's murder, the burning of the convent, the chase through the woods. Their voices were steady, their testimony detailed and consistent, and when they finished, there wasn't a person in that courtroom who doubted them. The verdict came back in less than an hour: guilty on all counts for both Thorne and Turner. The hanging was scheduled for December 30th, public execution as the law required. Caleb attended with the three women their right as victims to witness justice done. The scaffold had been built in the town square, and most of Missoula turned out to watch. Thorne's last words were defiant: "God will judge you all." Turner said nothing, just closed his eyes and waited for the drop. Caleb watched them fall and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just a cold acknowledgement that this chapter was closed. Beside him, Kate watched without expression until it was over, then turned away and vomited into the snow. Grace held her hair back and murmured soft comfort, while Margaret stood with her hand on Kate's shoulder, all three women bound together by what they'd survived. Afterward, they walked to the church where Father Thomas was waiting. He'd requested this meeting, said there were decisions to be made, formalities to be observed. "The Archbishop has sent word," Thomas said when they were seated in the small rectory office. "In light of what happened, in light of St. Catherine's destruction, you three are released from your vows. You're free to choose your own paths now." Margaret spoke first. "I can't take vows again, Father. I've killed men. I'm not pure enough for the convent anymore." "None of us are pure, Margaret," Thomas said gently. "But you can still serve God if you choose." "I'll serve him my own way," Margaret said, "out in the world, building something new instead of hiding behind walls." Kate's turn. "I want to help people Voss and Thorne hurt. Other women they sold, other families destroyed by men like them. Can't do that from a convent." Thomas nodded, understanding. "And you, Grace?" Grace looked at Caleb, who was waiting outside the church, visible through the window. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but certain. "I love him, Father. Is that a sin?" Thomas followed her gaze. "No, child. It's grace. Real grace, the kind God intended. Not the absence of sin, but the presence of love, despite our flaws." "Then I choose him," Grace said, "if he'll have me." Thomas stood, placed his hands on each of their heads in turn, and spoke the words that released them from vows made in a different life. "Go with God," he said. "Live fully, love deeply, and remember that holiness isn't found in buildings, but in how we treat each other when the world is watching and when it's not." Outside the church, Grace found Caleb leaning against the wall, his hat in his hands, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. "I'm free," she said. "Officially. No more vows binding me to anything except what I choose." "What will you do?" Caleb asked, though his eyes said he already knew the answer and was terrified she might give a different one. "Depends," Grace said. "Are you asking?" Caleb turned his hat in his hands, searching for words he'd never learned to say properly. "Grace Miller. I'm 42 years old. I'm broke. I'm scarred inside and out. I live on a mountain that tried to kill all of us. But I love you. And if you'll have me, I'll spend every day I've got left earning that love and trying to be the man you seem to think I am." Grace smiled, and in that smile, Caleb saw his future unfolding in ways he'd never dared imagine. "Yes," she said simply. They were married 2 weeks later in the same church where Grace had been released from her vows, with Father Thomas presiding and Margaret and Kate standing as witnesses. It was a small ceremony, just the five of them, and Sarah Whitmore, who'd become something like family through the shared trauma of the siege. Margaret bought a ranch 10 miles from Caleb's cabin with money she'd inherited from her parents and never touched. She married a widower rancher in 1882, a quiet man who'd lost his wife to influenza and his children to the loneliness that followed. Together, they built something good, raised 3 children who knew their mother had once been a nun, who learned to shoot and wasn't afraid of anything that walked or crawled or flew. Kate started an organization to help trafficking victims traveling the country to testify in trials against men like Voss and Thorne. Her rage transformed into purpose. She never married, never wanted to content with the family she'd found and the work that gave her life meaning. She died in 1909 of a stroke, 54 years old, surrounded by women she'd saved who called her their guardian angel. Grace and Caleb rebuilt the cabin, adding rooms as they needed them, transforming the hermit's shelter into a home that echoed with life instead of loneliness. They had one daughter, Sarah, named after the neighbor who'd ridden to their rescue when it mattered most. They raised her to be strong and kind and unafraid, and she grew up knowing the story of how her parents met, how three nuns and a mountain man had survived winter and siege and became family. The years passed like water over stones, wearing away the sharp edges of trauma, but leaving the essential shapes intact. Caleb never forgot the 3 seconds that killed Daniel, but he stopped letting it define every moment that followed. Grace never forgot the sisters who died in the burning convent, but she honored them by living fully instead of hiding from life. Together they built something worth the pain it had cost to find each other. Margaret died first in 1901, pneumonia taking her during a hard winter. They buried her on a hill overlooking her ranch, and Caleb carved her marker himself, Margaret Walsh, beloved wife and mother who learned to shoot and never missed what mattered. Kate followed in 1909, and they brought her body back to Montana, buried her beside Margaret because that's where she belonged with her sisters, who'd survived fire and siege and became something stronger than blood. Grace died peacefully in 1916, 59 years old, holding Caleb's hand and telling him she'd loved every minute of their life together, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, because those were the minutes that proved love was real. Caleb buried her beside Margaret and Kate, three graves on a hill above his cabin, three women who'd walked through fire and taught him what redemption looked like. Now in November 1917, 77 years old and dying from consumption, Caleb Stone lay in the same cabin where he'd sheltered three terrified nuns 40 years ago and told their story to his grandson one last time. And that's how three nuns walked into my life and taught me what it means to be worth dying for. He finished, his voice barely a whisper. Thomas Jr. sat silent, processing everything he'd heard. Outside, the November wind howled like it had that winter, and Caleb could almost hear Grace humming Margaret's sharp laugh, Kate's quiet presence. Grandma Grace was a nun, Thomas asked. Was Caleb confirmed. Then she chose a different path, chose me. Never regretted it, she told me so the day she died. What about the fighting, the killing? Did you regret that? Caleb coughed, tasted blood. Every day. Took 7 lives defending them. See their faces sometimes, but I'd do it again, because protecting people you love, that's what it means to be a man. Not violence, not toughness, love. Fierce, unbreakable love, willing to do hard things when hard things are required. He reached under his pillow, pulled out 3 wooden tokens carved 40 years ago during that first winter when he'd been trying to figure out how to tell 3 strangers they belonged in his life. These were theirs,
Not done
he
yet.
said, pressing them into
This
Thomas's hand. Margaret's, Kate's, Grace's. I carved them that first December before Thorn came, when I still thought I could keep them safe by keeping them distant. Wore them their whole lives. Kept them after they passed. Thomas looked at the tokens, 3 simple pieces of wood carved with different patterns worn smooth from decades of being touched and held and remembered. Carry them to war, Caleb said. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. 3 seconds of fear killed my brother. Don't let 3 seconds define your life. Move when moving matters. Fight when fighting's necessary. Love when love appears, because it doesn't appear often and it doesn't wait. I'm scared, Grandpa, Thomas admitted. Good. Fear keeps you alive. Just don't let it freeze you. Caleb's breathing was getting shallower now, each breath a struggle. Thomas held his grandfather's hand, felt how cold it was getting, how the life was draining out like water from a cracked cup. Tell your children about the 3 nuns, Caleb whispered. Keep the story alive. Tell them family isn't who you're born to. It's who you die for. He closed his eyes then, and his breathing went quiet, and Thomas sat holding his hand, while the old man who'd saved 3 women and been saved by them in return finally found the peace he'd been seeking since a river took his brother and left him alone with guilt and grief. 2 days later, they buried Caleb beside Grace, and now there were 4 graves on the hill, augury Kate, Grace, and Caleb family by choice together in death as they'd been in life. The years turned. The world spun through another war and another, and Thomas Jr. survived the first and sent his own son to the second. In 1945, when the fighting was finally over and the survivors were coming home, Thomas brought his grandson to Montana, to the cabin that still stood, despite decades of weather and neglect, to the hill, where 4 graves waited under the wind and sky. Who were they? The boy asked, looking at the weathered markers. Family, Thomas said. Not born, but chosen. The strongest kind. He placed new wooden crosses on the graves replacements for the ones time and weather had worn away, and hung the 3 tokens Caleb had given him from their necks. Margaret's, Kate's, Grace's, still smooth from being held and remembered. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the snow gold and orange, and for a moment Thomas could almost see them, 3 nuns and a mountain man, standing together against the wind and bound by something stronger than blood or vows or time. Family isn't who you're born to, he told his grandson, repeating the words Caleb had spoken 30 years ago. It's who you die for. Remember that. Tell your children. Keep the story alive. The boy nodded, solemn with the weight of inheritance, and together they stood on the hill as the sun went down and the stars came out cold and bright and eternal as the story they'd carry forward into whatever future was coming. Behind them, the cabin stood empty but not forgotten, its walls still holding the memory of a winter when 4 broken people found each other and built something worth the blood and fear and love it cost. The wind carried their names into the darkness. Margaret, Kate, Grace, Caleb. 4 souls who'd walked through fire and emerged as family. And on a hill in Montana, 4 graves stood witness that some stories once told never really end. They just wait for the next person brave enough to believe them.